All right. People still trickling in, but I will kick us off. A very warm welcome to all of the panel who have given up some of their time to join us today in our launch. Very excited to be launching the Australasian Cyber Law Institute this afternoon with what I think will be a fascinating talk. So I'm going to begin with an acknowledgement to country. This panel is being held wherever we're all tuning in Australia, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, for those of us here in Melbourne, and we wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. We also pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. It is my great pleasure to introduce now our moderator for this afternoon's panel, Jaynaya Winmar. Jaynaya is a proud Noongar Balladong woman from the Quarry-Drang in the Wheatbelt region of Western Australia. Jaynaya is founder and CEO of the Blackbone Sisterhood, Managing Director of Essential Services Australia Group, and General Manager of Indigenous Engagement for the AIA Group. She's the former National Reconciliation Relationships Manager at Indigenous Technology and Telecommunications Network, the INTTN. She's also a member of organisations including the Kinaway Victorian Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce, the Noongar Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Victorian Indigenous Professionals Network, and SHEEO, which is an acronym I love. Jaynaya has a strong background in the education and training industry and dedicates herself to developing and strengthening Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurship, all of which keeps you so busy. Please accept my thanks for making your time to be here this afternoon, Jaynaya. Very happy to hand over to you.
Thank you, EJ, and welcome everybody. I also would like to acknowledge the land on which I stand on, the Kulin Nation, and thank them for welcoming me over to their country. I apologise in advance for my glasses because I haven't managed to figure out the virtual background, so apologies. And I just wanted to introduce Ed Stantow. So Ed has been the Human Rights Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission since 2016, during which time he has led the Human Rights and Technology Inquiry. He has also focused on refugees and migrants, human rights issues affecting LGBT people, counter-terrorism and national security, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and implementing the operational protocol of the Convention Against Torture. Ed's roles prior to the Australian Human Rights Commission include Chief Executive of the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, a Senior Lecturer at University of New South Wales Law School, a Research Director at Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law. Thank you, Ed. Apologies, there's a lot of amazing people on our panel today, and bear with me while I get through everyone's bio. Suelette Dreyfus, Dr. Suelette Dreyfus is a lecturer at the School of Computing and Information Technology at the University of Melbourne and frequently public commentator in the media on IT-related topics. Her main area of research are cybersecurity and hacking, digital privacy and anonymity. The impact of technology in integrated system, whistleblowing, and social media as a tool of language and learning in schools. Suelette wrote the first mainstream book about computer hacking in Australia, Underground Hacking, Madness and Obsession on the Electronic Frontier. As a member of the inaugural ACLI committee, so welcome to Dr. Suelette. David Watts is one of Australia's leading data protection experts with the experience as a regulator, policymaker and public and private sector lawyer. David has roles including Victorian Commissioner for Privacy, Data Protection and Task Force Leader on Big Data and Open Data for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. David is currently Principal Lawyer at Data Protection Legal and Professor of Information Law and Policy at La Trobe University. Welcome, David. Ariel Bogle Ariel is an award-winning technology reporter at the ABC. Ariel has previously held roles at the Convention of Slate's Future Tense and Mashable, with work published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Australian Financial Review, and Slate. Ariel's recent work explores topics including COVID-safe tracing app, disinformation on social media, and facial recognition technology. Welcome, Ariel. Now that you've got to meet our panel, I'm just going to get them all to introduce themselves eventually, but I just wanted to do some housekeeping. Apologies for not doing it earlier. All questions that for today are to be directed to the question and answer section. So I will be moderating that. So please, if you have any questions for our amazing panel, type your answers in there and we'll get to those. So our first question that we have, and I'll direct this at Dr. Suelette. So the pandemic has brought into a sharp focus a range of social imbalances and problems. This has been everything from economic privilege, race privilege, gender privilege, technology privilege, right through to accessing to clean water and healthcare. For us in Australia, we have seen some really positive community-based responses, but we have also seen who has well-grounded fears of trusting the government with our lives, and the private information is integral to those lives. I'm going to go to each one of you and ask what to explain the social contact in which each citizen with the harm something like the COVID tracing app would cause. So Dr. Suelette.
Turn my mute. Yep, can you hear me? Good, welcome, thank you. I think the issue with the tracing app, which is really, in a sense, an embodiment and a piece of technology that represents this social contract between the individual and the state, is how much trust do you have to place in the state not to take more information than it needs to, and not to put that information in an insecure place. And that includes data sovereignty issues, not just a hacker attacking it, and not to repurpose that information for other purposes. So there are two versions of structures of COVID tracing and notification apps, or notification apps as they're more correctly described: a centralized and a decentralized app. The critical difference between them is that in a decentralized app, your phone is walking around and it's sending out little ID pings, and you're getting little ID pings from all the people who you might be in contact with. And if you, in a decentralized system, upload your ID to see whether or not it goes on a master list that goes to other people, and they can check, oh, have I been in contact with this ID? It's an automatic process, but have I been in contact? In a centralized system, such as Australia has, you are uploading the list of all the other IDs that have come in to you. And the risk of that from a privacy standpoint is that a centralized body then has the potential to be able to socially map who's connected to who, for how long, where they stay, and all the rest of it. That's aggravated by the fact that the Australian government didn't instill much trust when it first released the app, because it didn't make the source code behind the app, the code that drives the app, public. And when it did make a part of the source code public, the part that's running on your phone, it didn't make the part that's running on the servers in the centralized authority public. And that means that there's some things happening up there that we don't know what it is because we can't see the source code. By contrast, Google and Apple have, to their credit, designed a very open source, transparent API. That is now being used in some 22 or more countries. And even countries that traditionally have been very reluctant about the big IT companies because they were worried about privacy with places, not surprisingly, like Google, like Germany, have swapped midstream and chosen to take up the decentralized app, even though it relies on them. And also Ireland, and surprisingly the UK, which started down the path of a centralized app. So here we see this, if you will, domino of countries that have opted to change the app. And they've done so in part because of public outcry about concern about the social mapping. So you can imagine the power of having information about, I know what phone was in close proximity to your phone for the last 8 hours overnight. That tells you something about your personal life, your relationship. I know that your app is in proximity of a psychiatrist for an hour on Tuesday afternoons, or a labor union meeting, you know, on Friday nights, or political party meeting. These things are potentially very private pieces of information. Now, maybe people wouldn't be that concerned about it, although the poor uptake of the app does tend to suggest that there is a lack of trust. Except that we see now this trend of a repurposing of agencies' roles. So we've just seen announced recently the Australian Signals Directorate. This is a technical agency designed to actually spy on foreigners outside Australia, is now potentially going to be used to spy on Australian citizens. When you repurpose an agency, it's not surprising that people might feel as though that social contract had been breached, and they wonder, well, if you can do that with the whole agency, maybe you would also do that with my personal health data, with my connections data. So trust is broken. I think the fact that Australia wouldn't change tracks, even though it modeled its app on Singapore, who totally open sourced their app, by the way, and Singapore only got initially, I think, a 20% uptake of its app, so not a huge success in numbers. Instead of choosing the more successful option, it chose the more controlling option. And I think that that sends a message about the relationship that the government wants to have with people. And that concerns people. And that's one reason that we don't have the 50 or 60% uptake. In fact, the stories that you read on social media is that when the Prime Minister said, oh, we have to get to this target, you know, then we'll let everybody, you know, out of their lockdowns. People were downloading the app, installing the app, and not running the app, not turning the app on, just so they thought the clock would tick over, so that they would be free from this lockdown without ever having to actually tie up their privacy. So I think that is really, for me, one of the key elements of where technology and COVID-19 intersect to address the kind of cutting edge frontier space of this social contract.
Thank you, Suelette. Edward, would you like to give your version of that? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic analysis that Suelette has given us, and I'm really grateful that she was able to kind of walk us through the technical elements of the app. I guess fundamentally, when it comes to something like a tracing app, there are two particular things that are being held in balance. On the one hand, we're being asked to give up some of our personal information, as Suelette put it, where essentially it's impinging on our privacy. And the promise is very explicit, that this will help to keep us safe. And when that was introduced, that app was introduced a few months ago, it was exactly that. It was a promise. It was something that had never really been done before at scale, certainly not here in Australia. And it was hoped that it would do just that. And so what we need to do from a human rights perspective to see whether that has been, that promise has been adhered to, is we have to ask a series of questions. And the most fundamental question is, does this app work? In other words, is it being effectively used to help with the tracing process? And the safeguards that were built into the architecture of the app, as it was explained to us, and many of which were set out in the legislation itself, are those also being really rigorously adhered to? And so one of the things that the Human Rights Commission advocated for very strongly when the app was going through was real-time monitoring of the app and its operation, and then at particular moments in time to step back and take stock and ask the question, how effective is it at achieving its core aim, and are those protections being properly respected? It's our good friends and colleagues at the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner that has primary responsibility for that. And of course, they're better placed to I guess, respond to whether there are issues that have been raised with them. But I guess what we've seen in the media so far is some questions raised about how effective the app is at performing its core task. There's been some material that's been before a couple of parliamentary committees that have really called into question how effective the architecture of that is. So we're not in a good place to be able to comment on that, but I think those are critical questions that need to be answered.
Great, thanks, Ed. Ariel, I'd like to ask your version of that response, but also that we have a question which you might be able to cover in your response is, for the app, aren't the IDs only uploaded on a request by the health department when the person has tested positive?
Yes, that's correct. So if somebody is diagnosed with COVID-19, a health authority can ask them if they have the app, and if they do, if they're willing to have the data from the app uploaded onto the server. But I do want to point out, I think this was a misunderstanding from the start. The government initially said that the app would only be useful, but only be used at a certain close contact benchmark, which they said was somebody within 1.5 meters for 15 minutes. So I think a lot of people assumed the app would only record a contact if that benchmark had been reached. In fact, the app collects every ping it gets within Bluetooth range, and all of that is uploaded onto the government server, at which point some sort of sorting takes place that puts it in in that benchmark of 15-minute at 1.5 meters. But the government has not seen fit to share the algorithm that they use to do that sorting, which has been requested by multiple people, academics, including myself. So I think there's some lack of transparency there. So to echo what Suelette and Edward said, there's not so much to add to what they said, except that it was interesting at the beginning of this whole process. I think the government realised that it did need to build some sort of rapport, some sort of trust with the public. And at the beginning, it felt like it was being unusually forthcoming. So they released the privacy impact assessment for the app, which, interesting as a sidebar, they won't release the privacy impact assessment for their other COVID safe information app for some reason. So maybe someone can send me a tip about what the difference is there. But they were releasing information like that, so it seemed like there was going to be more transparency about the app and its function. But since then, since the app's come out, it's been next to impossible to extract information about, as Edward pointed out, whether the app is in fact working. It was only under a question on notice in front of a committee looking at the COVID response that we first got data about whether the app was successfully performing, full stop. We don't really know even how many people are using it daily anymore. We only know some sort of broad download numbers, but we don't know how many people still have it installed, whether it's working correctly. So I think this could have been an exercise in trust building with the public, but I feel that given the difficulty of extracting information at the moment about the app and its function and all those elements, that seems to have fallen by the wayside. And as Suelette pointed out, we could have moved to this decentralized model, the Google Apple model, but the government has repeatedly said that it's not willing to move to such a model because it wants a sort of human element in the process. It wants health authorities to be there asking someone to download the information from the app, and it wants humans sorting it to an extent. The Google Apple model doesn't have that sort of human in the loop. So it claims that that's an important part of the health process, but I guess there would be various opinions on whether that's truly necessary.
Thanks, Ariel, and thanks, Aria, for your question. David, your response.
Well, there's not very much to say after all of that. But maybe I can look at the issues this way. So I come to this from an unusual background. So I've been privacy regulator and I've been a security regulator, but I was also been general counsel of both the Commonwealth Health Department and the Department of Human Services, as it then was. And so I've been involved in pandemic planning and looking at issues around public health powers and the development of Victoria's public health legislation, etc., etc. And so I come to it. I come to this with a great support for privacy, but also a great support for the implementation of proper health initiatives. And I think one of the issues that we have in this whole debate, it lays bare the paucity and the shallowness and fragility of our human rights system. So we're the only OECD country without a Bill of Rights, and so human rights in Australia are a very slight thing, and so there is no general right to privacy, and there is no right to privacy based around a Bill of Rights that many other countries, the rest of the OECD, would have. One of the consequences of that, and the same for any other human right, so one of the consequences for that is that we really lack a jurisprudence. In other words, the legal precedents and techniques that are needed for us to analyse this sort of social contract, the sort of trade-offs and the issues associated with how you look at how you control pandemic diseases, but also how you deal with privacy at the same time. One of the things that's important for everyone to know is that privacy is not an absolute right in international law. So it's not a jus cogens right. It's a right that can be limited, and it's also a right that needs to be looked at in the perspective of other rights. So we have a right to security. We also have a right to health at international law under Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Again, not enacted into Australian law, but I think when we start talking about social contracts and we start talking about trade-offs, etc., we need to look at both. And we do have a right to health. We do have a right to security. I think it's pretty strongly arguable that a pandemic disease is a security issue. And I think most of the scholars of security studies would agree with that as well. So I'm not one of those people who says, okay, well, privacy trumps it all. And when we designed privacy laws back 20 years ago, and I was involved in that design, there are plenty of exceptions from rights, in the Privacy Act to rights for privacy when people's health, welfare and safety are at stake. So the question then is, where does that balance lie? And we don't have a really fantastic legal background within which to place a lens to analyse all of this properly. My own view is that rights to privacy are trumped by rights to protect health and safety, but only in accordance with the usual international law tests of reasonableness, necessity, legality, and proportionality. Those are the tests that we need to use, but they have not been an explicit part of the debate that's gone on in relation to the COVID Safe app. The other thing I'd like to just note is that the COVID Safe app was supposed to work, and it doesn't. It just simply doesn't. And I think Ariel highlighted this point, and I think it's a really important one. The damn thing doesn't work. And you know, I've been in Melbourne, locked down virtually since March. And, you know, I was told that, you know, there was a trade-off. And part of the trade-off was going to be that I would be able, you know, that there would be an app and, you know, it would be there to help us do contact tracing. Clearly, Victoria's contact tracing has failed. And here is a backstop that should have been able to safeguard our right to health and safeguard our right to security, and it hasn't. So I think that we need to look at it through a very unsatisfactory legal framework that we have in Australia, which is really, really unfortunate. And I think we need to look at it through a technical lens, and the technical lens is it just hasn't worked. We haven't had any transparency about why it doesn't work and what the problems have been. I think that's also problematic as well. All of that threatens our security, and I think we need to, you know, look quite expansively at what our rights to security are. And think about those not as just isolated sort of things, but look at, you know, how health applies to that and how privacy also contributes to that.
Thanks for that, David. It kind of brings us onto that next point. Entrusting the government of the day to accept the restrictions we have in is one thing, but to accept the permanent changes to legislation and to even the data the government can mine from that an app like the COVID app is a trap. It is currently being undone. I might trust the present government, but I won't know what strange government of the future might wish to use this information for an alternative purpose. So I asked both Ed and David, does it all come down to the agreement that I enter into in downloading the app?
I'm happy to have a first swing at that. The short answer is no. So here's the dirty little secret about the right to privacy that human rights people like me don't like to admit. Unlike almost every other human right, privacy comes with a kind of a ghost in the machine. You can unlock privacy protections by gaining an individual's consent. Now that is a real problem when you have what amounts to too often not real consent, fake consent. And we all, I guess, are kind of architects in our own privacy destruction in some ways, because I suspect everybody on this panel and everybody listening in has at some point, and probably quite often, done exactly what I've done, which is to, you know, agree to a set of terms and conditions, a privacy statement, without actually going into the depths of it. And that's a logical thing, because you know, that's not a real conversation with the company. Like if Google or Facebook or whatever asks you to agree, you can't sort of say, well, I agree to terms 1, 2, and 3, but not to term 4. Let's work out some kind of compromise that we can all be happy with. That's just not how it works. That's not the architecture of the system, particularly online, that we have become accustomed to. That's a real problem, because what it means is individuals basically end up agreeing, in inverted commas, to huge incursions or potentially huge incursions on their privacy without properly turning their mind to it. And in any event, they're basically being held over a barrel. There's no real capacity to kind of compromise or say no. Last time we had a situation like this as a society was about 40 or 50 years ago, when we had situations like this. A typical situation would be like this: you go into to a car yard and you're interested in buying a car. You'll be given this big long contract, and basically the contract will say crazy things like, you know, if the car blows up as you're driving it out off the car yard, you've already bought it, it's your problem. We don't take any responsibility for any negligence or any harm that you suffer. And ultimately, countries like Australia, you know, OECD countries, liberal democracies, almost universally said that just cannot stand. You cannot be left in a situation where you're effectively contracting out of basic consumer protections. And so I would say that the agreement, these sort of agreements that people kind of sign up to or click through without properly turning their minds to, that can't be the primary protection. And so when we were giving input on the COVID Safe app, just as an example, we were saying you need to put as many of those protections in the legislation itself. That's the thing that you can actually stand behind. That's something that will actually really bite. And those are things that people essentially aren't being asked to contract their way out of. So to my mind, that's where we need to kind of focus our attention, making sure that the legislation sets up a situation that is fair, that's the default, that people's personal information, when it's something like a tracing app, is being used in ways that is safe, as Suelette pointed out, that proper privacy and security safeguards are in place, but also that there's no overuse or misuse that is legally permissible.
Thanks, Ed. And in response to the same question, I'd ask Suelette and Ariel, if anyone wants, whichever one of you wants to take this, are there any of these agreements, even in the terms of the average Australian will understand, with the COVID app being the example? Ariel?
Yeah, I'd go. Well, the language used in privacy agreements, as Edward has alluded to, like just really impossible to pass. I mean, for any person. So in general with these things, I don't assume that somebody can read them and really conclude and make any decision for themselves. So it was interesting with the COVID Safe app, as has been alluded to. The government came out very strongly with this line that we need this certain benchmark, 40% of Australians to download it, and then you get out of the house. And I think what went through a lot of people's minds is I think people are quite cognizant of the privacy risks of apps. They understand that their phones collect data. They have some nervousness about government collected data. You can really see that from the response to My Health Record a few years ago when that was a big discussion in the media. People are conscious of these risks, but they make a risk assessment, or they assess for themselves on balance the greater evil. So getting out of the house versus giving up some data to the government was something that a lot of people were trying to pass. And a lot of people wanted to do it well. It was interesting. I got a lot of messages from the public, Twitter DMs and everything, of people being like, "What? This app won't work," or "My phone's too old to get this app." They felt some feeling of failure for this, task that they'd been given by the government in quite an extraordinary situation. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that we need to present apps like this, if we're going to make them at all, in a way that helps people make that risk assessment for themselves. And I guess too, I don't know if the privacy policy on a private app or a government app will ever be the saving grace. Surely we need to ask the question about, even before the app gets built, do we need this app full stop? I mean, what is the task the app is setting out to achieve? Is this the best way of achieving it? And recognizing that in general, the state will try and build apps that are built with the values of surveillance and control. That just seems to be the default. It's not limited to Australia, it seems to be the global default. So come to questions like this with that framework as well. So starting from there would be a helpful way to look at problems like this too.
Awesome, thank you, Ariel. Now, just some questions for all of you. Suelette, in your sector of the cyber tech, what would be the best two outcomes and the worst two outcomes from the pandemic from your perspective?
In terms of what I actually think will be good outcomes, there is obviously an enhanced awareness of privacy and of how technology can track your movements, even though the COVID safe tracing app is not doing what some people may think it is, which is following it around geolocationally exactly in the way that they probably think it is. So I think some awareness is good. On a more sort of personal level, I think that it's the one sort of silver lining in this cloud is that in some ways our connection with family and friends far away has been strengthened. So even though you're in isolation, because we are more standardly having catch-ups with family and friends locally online, I do think people are picking up the phone, the Zoom phone, to have conversations with their friends and relatives, even the ones who are isolated in London or wherever. And actually, it is great that a plethora of platforms are now out there and are free or relatively free. And that education is potentially being revolutionized by this to the degree that we're encouraging people to learn online, teach online, kind of get used to that and the sharing of information. So those are some good things that have kind of come out of it. I think some negative things that come out of it is that it's potentially empowered government to exercise more authoritarian power using technology to watch people. And as we've seen in the US police and in other countries, police force activity being of a very much more aggressive nature and controlling nature. I think that we don't get the same messages from government that we would like to have. So in a bushfire, you get messages regularly back and forth. Well, yeah, I don't know about you. I don't really feel like I'm getting messages except from press conferences, and then it's not really engagement. It's just broadcast out. I'm not sure the government's engagement has been terribly sophisticated. I did want to, is it possible for me to share a slide? Are you guys okay if I share a slide on this? Because I think it might be quite useful to make a comment. Let me jump in and tell me if I shouldn't do that. I'll just see if I can share this just on that issue of the complexity. This is something, so I actually am teaching the COVID Safe app in a subject to my students who are mostly third-year students at university, and Associate Professor Vanessa Teague and Dr. Chris Culnane, who've both done amazing work in this space, came to speak in the class. This just describes what are you actually sending out by Bluetooth. So in the context of when you agree to something, do you actually understand what you're agreeing to? I don't know, hands up everyone in the room who can understand what this diagram says. In fact, if you don't have people from the community who are willing to step forward, who are independent, fiercely independent minded, and willing to do the kind of analysis to say, this is what it means and this is what it implies for your privacy, you may never understand that. In terms of the functionality, I think it's quite interesting, and I'll just pull that one up as well. From these slides that Vanessa and I put together. This is actually the review of the app on Google Play. As you can see, it's not terribly well loved by its users, a number of whom have criticisms of it because all of a sudden it didn't seem to work. But in fact, what had happened was a series of updates weren't coming through to the app, and so it was never really working properly the way it was meant to before. And then once that was fixed, it wasn't working properly after in its functionality. And people said, it used to work, the app used to work, and now it doesn't work anymore. I don't understand why. It was never working properly. So going to that question of that, I think the fact that it's got some pretty bad reviews, people talking about how it's a waste of public money. And I think part of what was, part of the concern is that there was some misrepresentation by some politicians about what the app did. The app is not sunscreen, okay, despite what our politicians may tell us. I think there are some members of the public, if you looked at social media, who were saying, oh, the app is where if I go to the supermarket and I'm within 1.5 meters of someone who's tested positive for COVID, an alarm is going to go off on my phone and tell me, and I could just move away from them, and that way I won't get sick, which is, of course, not at all how the app functions. So those would be kind of my comments overall. I hope you guys don't mind me sharing some of those slides, and thank you to both Vanessa and Chris. But hopefully that might give you some insights into where a slew of the problems have been. There was one other thing I just wanted to touch on, the human interface. The comment that the Australian government had made about wanting the human in the loop. Ireland has actually done something quite good, which is in their decentralized app, they have allowed a human in the loop, and they've allowed the humans who use the app to choose to have that interface experience be with a human. So a person can decide, no, I actually want to talk to a human about this rather than having it technology interfaced. And that is a fantastic feature. And in fact, I think Ireland has had one of the highest uptakes of any country of the app, and perhaps that's one reason why. I'm not sure. Thanks.
Thank you, Suelette. David, do you want to share your two best and worst? But you just don't.
I'll unmute myself. I couldn't think of too many positive outcomes. I think negative outcomes. I think in security terms, and we're talking about, you know, the launch of a cyber organisation here. I think in security terms, what is clear that's happened is that information is now distributed far more broadly outside of employers' networks and into people's homes. And I think that is a really important thing for us to note in terms of security risk. So you're not in hardened systems all the time anymore. You're in your own Wi-Fi that may not be secure. Commercial and government organisations have information distributed on computers all over the place, on laptops, and being and the information in them and to them is being distributed all over the place in probably many insecure methods. So there's a greatly enhanced cybersecurity risk as far as I can see. So that is one of the key issues here, and I think it's an issue that's not going to diminish very quickly. I think there's also a really key issue here about workplace surveillance and an increased tendency, I note, for employers to want to know what employees are doing in their own homes, and to put into software packages that employees use, software that monitors what they're doing. And I think that's a really dangerous thing to do. And I think that is something that not very many people have paid much attention to. I think that there are some problems, you know, with governments just getting drunk on unaccountable power, and there being no corresponding accountabilities for the exercise of that power. I think the untrammeled use of executive power, both in the federal government and the state government, is concerning. And I note that, you know, governments want to get more information about us, but they want to provide us with much less information about, you know, what's going on within government. And so there are problems, I think, with accountability in relation to it all. And I'm sorry, I really can't think of too many. I can't think of anything positive. You know, maybe we've all learnt, you know, that we don't need to get on a train or tram or bus every morning. Maybe that's a really good thing for climate change. I'm not sure that, you know, whether that's going to exist long term, but there's a quick tasting menu of the downside.
Yeah, so David, in response to that, we've got a question that kind of draws back to that. So in saying that, like, there's a lot of issues with it, what tools do we have that are to get a better guidance in front of them next time, like legal restraints, relationship building, society action? What is your basic version of that? I know that's a big question to ask, and you can probably answer it all day. But yeah, just in a nutshell, what do you think?
So let me ask you a question. Was that a question about workplace surveillance, or was it a question about just cybersecurity risk generally?
Risk generally.
Risk generally. I think one of the things that employers are going to have to do is they're going to have to look at their systems now and risk rate them from a much broader perspective. In other words, in the knowledge that their employees are going to be working from home outside controlled environments. And really the only way to do that is to do that through a proper risk assessment. And it may be that, you're going to have certain levels of encryption on Wi-Fi networks, et cetera. Remember also that this sort of stuff has to be proportionate. So, a lot of information that government produces, you could put in a box outside the front door and it really wouldn't matter to anyone. You could do that every night and it really wouldn't matter. There's very, in comparison to, all government information, the amount that's, really secret is just minuscule. And for the Victorian government, it's even more minuscule. For many corporations and government, you've got to be really careful not to overstate what information risks are, because that really creates problems. So I think there has to be a proportionate response, a proper risk rating of what sort of things that, what sort of systems and what sort of risks are involved. And corporations and government are going to have to look much more broadly at it all, and look at where their employees are working, whether it's going to be at a cafe or at home or on the road somewhere, but much more attention paid to that.
Thanks, David. I'm just having a read through from the questions, so thank you everybody for putting your questions in there. Ed, can I direct this one to you? There is one in there from Ariel again, not Ariel, sorry Ariel, Aria. We have seen an instance for employers to monitor employer monitoring going beyond what might be considered ethical. What would you what would your opinion be on this?
We're certainly seeing greater use of some technologies like facial recognition, including in workplaces. Sometimes it's more kind of at the proposal level than in reality, but either way, I think we should be deeply concerned about it. Some of the downsides of using facial recognition, particularly when we're talking about one-to-many facial recognition, not the kind of facial recognition that might unlock your smartphone if you're lucky enough to have a very recent one, but the kind of facial recognition that is used to identify you essentially in a virtual crowd, or do even more exotic things than that. We know that kind of thing can be deeply risky in terms of privacy, but more fundamentally, the errors when that sort of technology is used are, in my view, completely unacceptable. Very, very high rates of errors, and the errors are not evenly distributed across the community. The sort of groundbreaking research done by people like Joy Buolamwini from MIT and the Algorithmic Justice League have shown that sort of technology, facial recognition that is, can be basically it's only ever sort of reasonably accurate at best when it's used on people that look exactly like me. So white, middle-aged men, ideally unbearded. It's, that's when it's working at its best. But if you don't happen to meet that description, if you're a person of color, if you are a woman, if you have a physical disability, and God forbid if you have more than one of those factors present, it becomes wildly inaccurate very quickly. And so I think we should be deeply concerned about, sort of under the cover of a pandemic, that sort of technology being rolled out with very limited human rights safeguards, if any, and with very little justification. I guess to return to something I said right at the start, the only way in which you can justify an impingement or an incursion on someone's human rights, like their right to privacy, is if you have a really legitimate aim that you're kind of pursuing, and that you do it in a way that is reasonable, necessary, proportionate, and according to law. And I think too often we're seeing this sort of more cavalier approach where that's being we're in a pandemic. We don't have time to consider those things, and just being pursued. That to me, and I think to the Human Rights Commission more broadly, is worrisome.
Can I just point out that the Privacy Act, the Federal Privacy Act, has very, very limited or no coverage of employment relationships. Pre-employment relationships it does, yes, but it doesn't really apply when you're dealing with an employment relationship. It's, you know, one of the many exceptions. And so we enter an area where there are, you know, quite limited or even more limited remedies than we normally have. So again, it's an area that's really unregulated, or not sufficiently substantially regulated.
Thanks, David. Ariel, I'll give this one to you. There's a question. What is panel's view on the Privacy Amendment, Privacy Health Contact Information Act? For an example, in the early days of the COVID safe, Nikki developed a technique to measure real-world usage of the app, but shelved that project immediately when the legislation came in. And it did kind of touch on what you had brought up earlier. So would you like to answer that question?
Sure, I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
Just your views on the Privacy Amendment for the public health information. Yeah.
Oh, I can see the question is talking about whether the government has criminalised some avenues of legitimate research on the app. So yeah, I think the government was walking a fine line, I guess, in order to convince people to use the app. It decided that it would strictly limit by legislation how the data could be used, saying they could only be used by health professionals, government health professionals, for the purpose of contact tracing. So to limit, I suppose, fears that this data could be, say, used by Centrelink as part of its assessment of people's, you know, disability claims or anything like this. And so, yeah, I guess I have not really examined the question of it, whether it limits legitimate research, but I would say that it was disappointing, I suppose, for a lot of researchers who started digging into the app to find that there was not an easy way to communicate a plethora of errors with the app easily and in a simple way. I know at the beginning, I mean, as soon as the app launched, people were digging into it and finding errors, and some quite serious errors that would allow long-term tracking of people because of the way the app worked. Say the app was actually sharing more data than the government admitted. Say if you had a, you know, it said Ariel, you know, Ariel's Android phone, it would maybe be delivering that in plain text. Somebody could read that and, you know, figure out it was me, track me, these kinds of errors. And, you know, they were ringing the same public line that gets you nowhere to an automated system. They were emailing into the ether, no one answering. And I think that is a really disappointing, and it's not really the way, if the government's going to set itself up as a deliverer of tech products, as a developer, you know, itself, it needs to follow best practice of, you know, other tech companies which have even a bug bounty reporting process where people are even some kind of financial reward for finding the worst kinds of privacy invasive bugs, for example, because that's something that could really very much be improved. And I think communication has opened up a little better, but nevertheless, it's still quite hard, I think, for all these tech experts to get in touch with government. And it's also about who's in the room to begin with. So if you look at how the app was developed, I mean, there's a handful of contractors working on this thing, BCG, others. I mean, why weren't the best minds in security and privacy in Australia from a technical perspective and a legal perspective in the room from the start? Why did we have to approach this app with the same old government contracting, private consultancy tactic? So, I mean, so many things could have been done in a better, more efficient way.
Thank you, Ariel. Given we're almost coming to time, Suelette, there's one question on the Apple and Google have been mentioned as alternatives. How safe are they really, and what protections exist when the data is not held in Australia?
So the data sovereignty question is a really good one. It's a really good one because I would choose on a privacy basis the GAPL, as it's sometimes called, Google Apple, GAPL API-based decentralized app over the Australian centralized system, despite it being GAPL. And that's because the system in Australia is not only centralized and sort of less transparent because the code isn't made public and there's a central authority and we don't know exactly what they're doing with the data, and it's not entirely clear when they have to delete the overall data that they gathered. I don't mean just for a month, but I'm talking about the longer term data set. And how that will be oversighted in any sort of community sense, which I don't think it will be. But that information is, as I understand it, being using Amazon servers. So I'm pretty sure Amazon's not an Australian company. And also BCG, for those of you who don't know, it stands for Boston Consulting Group. Also no Boston in Australia. So those things tend to indicate that data sovereignty, if you're worried about whether this private data is going to be either stored offshore, given to companies that are not Australian companies, have not Australians working on it, those things all raise some questions that probably need to be answered. The other thing I would add to it, in the risk of this, one of the risks of the centralized system, two of the risks really, under cybersecurity is that by not making all of the elements of it open source, by not making the server code open source, it is not open to robust testing and critique by the broader community, technical community, as to where the security holes are. Now, the comment has been made that that code hasn't been made public because, you know, for security reasons. But in fact, if the code that runs on your phone has been made open source, and the community just in Australia alone, the volunteer community, has been able to find all of these security problems and functionality problems, then it does seem to be fairly important to have the centralized authorities code be open source as well. I was part of a group of about 100 academics and security researchers, industry-based researchers around the country, who signed an open letter on this issue asking the government to make all of the code open source before they actually release the app, but all of it, not just some of it. And that was partially off the back of the need for the cybersecurity protections that it would be given. And then the final thing on the cybersecurity front is, if you have a centralized system, you create a giant pot of gold. And that pot of gold is very attractive to hackers, not just hackers in a commercial or corporate espionage sense, but in a international state threat actor sense. And as we saw, for the example, not that long ago, the hack of Singapore Health, where hundreds of thousands of people had their data breached. And they know from the actual hacking attack, the hackers were in there for an extended period of time. They were targeting particularly the Prime Minister's health records. So it was a very targeted attack, most probably a state-based hacker attack. So having it all in one centralized repository that hasn't, using code that hasn't been tested by the technical community, looks to me like possibly a disaster waiting to happen. And so those, you know, if you balance all of that against the potential risk of using something that's been fully open source, fully publicly, made available and also reviewed by governments and countries that are fairly hostile to removal of privacy, like Germany, where they take privacy really seriously, data privacy really seriously. I would put my eggs in the latter basket in terms of privacy and security. That's my final word.
Awesome, thank you for that. We do have some more questions. Sorry, I'm reading them as I go. Edward, there's a question from Ian that in relation to the right to privacy, there is a concept that I've heard described as reasonable expectation of privacy. What is the view of the panel on this? Do you want to give a response to this one?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the concept of reasonable expectation of privacy, I guess, starts from the idea that privacy is not absolute. I think David may have made that point. Simply in kind of going out of your home, walking down the street, you are giving up some measure of privacy. And so the concept of reasonable expectation of privacy is designed to kind of give us a bit more of a sophisticated understanding of when you might be kind of engaging in the outside world, but you still may actually have some expectation or some reasonable expectation that some of your personal information will be properly protected. And so to put that kind of in simple terms, just by engaging with the outside world doesn't mean it's a free for all on your personal information. And that's a really, really important concept, because I think too often we're presented with these sort of binary choices. Either, if you want to stay safe, if you want to be a good kind of citizen in terms of COVID safe, then you have to sign up to having all of your personal information being passed through by anyone and everyone, or you're kind of confining yourself to kind of your bat cave and you can never come out. That's no one should be kind of expected to make that sort of extreme choice. And that's not how privacy law works. That's not how international human rights law and privacy works there either.
Thanks, Ed. David, there's one actually from David. The COVID app is the only example of the long series of it's supposed to say isn't an example of privacy and security policy decisions. Public debate is usually profound and the public stated justification for broader powers limited. Is the debate going on within government and under the hood better?
One of the real problems with that sort of trade-off debate is that it's always, or like almost always, easier to formulate the case to diminish privacy than it is to enhance privacy. So it's notoriously difficult to define what privacy is, and particularly in a jurisdiction like Australia, as I mentioned earlier, one of the problems is that we have such limited jurisprudence around human rights, but under civil law protections anyway, much less than any other developed Western country. So we don't really have a lot of guidance about what it is. Then you have very, very particular things that usually law enforcement or national security want to do, and they have reasonably good use cases that go with it. They'll say, yes, we want to keep metadata for a period of time so that we can address terrorist issues. And you go back and you say, well, but remember privacy issues, and they say, well, what privacy issues? And here we're trying to protect, your right to life and your right to safety and your right to security. And you might all remember, the very famous line that David Irvine, the then head of ASIO, said, during the metadata debate, where he said, I can't understand it. I can't understand you people. You'll give up all of your information to Facebook so that they can sell you a BMW, but you won't give your information to me at ASIO so I can protect your life. I think it's on YouTube somewhere. Please go check for it. But the arguments against it are much sharper arguments and much more difficult to resist. And one of the reasons for that is we just don't have that sort of privacy culture, that privacy jurisprudence that helps us do that. Yes, those things are debated within government. Yes, you know, they do end up being balanced against each other, but more than often, you know, particular use cases, you know, for national security, organised crime, law enforcement issues win the day. And then the problem becomes, you know, there is not sufficient oversight and remedies when those things go wrong.
Great, thanks, David. Ariel, there is one from an anonymous attendee. Even if the technology for this app were secure, are there broader concerns about the government track record on data security and transparency, even announcing this week that they will surveillance their own citizens? Could you kind of talk about what else needs to change? I know you did touch on it before with like your investigation stuff, but yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. So the track record, I mean, I guess there was a lot of cynicism and doubt coming into the COVID safe debate because of successive governments' poor track record when it comes to technology projects like this. I mean, it's not quite the same because it was an app, but My Health Record, as I mentioned before a few years ago, that was an online repository of people's health records that had been sort of sitting there for a while, but the government decided it was to be mandatory by a certain date. And that's, I guess, when people started paying attention, when we started digging into it. There were all kinds of regulatory loopholes, ways that parents could keep scrutinising their own children's health records, you know, past the age of 16, which is when kids are, should be able to access healthcare completely privately. There were issues about potential for workplace medical data sharing, so that an employer could potentially access an employee's health record. So I think, I mean, that was the kind of history and track record that the government was coming into COVID safe with. I think it did try and head some of those criticisms off at the pass, as I said, by introducing in legislation that the data could only be used for the purpose for which it had been collected, contact tracing. But I think we haven't really thought or talked that deeply about this data during the pandemic, you know, in a even bigger way than even just the app. Because I think, like, obviously this is the first pandemic I've lived through. Certainly the first pandemic that has been attended by so much digital technology. So it's sort of been unimaginable quantities of health data are now in existence, and once the data exists, you know, it's impossible to remove. It's not just the COVID safe data, but I'm thinking about every time you go to a pub or club, say in New South Wales, I think in most states now, the government has asked that all those venues collect people's names, their phone numbers, their emails, and they have, you know, they've been given this task of which they're doing it. You know, I've signed pieces of paper, I've filled in web forms, I've used QR codes, and there's absolutely no guidance given to these venues about, you know, which platform to use. Or, I mean, you know, I think most of them say we'll only use this for contact tracing, but they're using all kinds of commercial providers for that task. So where's that data going? Who's, you know, I feel an obligation to share my real phone number. In general, I won't do that, but I want, you know, I want to be getting the call if somebody in the restaurant has been diagnosed with COVID down the line. That's just one other example. I also think a lot about the way we're talking about our attitudes to health, our own diagnosis, what we're sharing on social platforms, on Facebook, YouTube, all the other platforms. We're giving up vast quantities of data about ourselves and our attitudes to health and, you know, social attitudes to health, which, I mean, can be used in kind of just an immense variety of ways. And all this data, government collected data, private data, can all be put together in ways I think we haven't really thought about yet, and sort of difficult to predict, but it certainly will happen. And there has been very little debate about that at the moment, I think. So just to be super negative to go out on, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of reverberations from this era of health data collection for years and years to come.
Amazing. Thank you, Ariel. And thank you to the rest of the panel too. I think EJ is going to come back on for our final words shortly. But yeah, thank you for all your questions that have come through. We have endeavoured to get through them. And we're just aware of that time has got the better of us because we've had an amazing time of talking about everything that everyone. Jay, are you back online yet?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm a little bit blanked out at the moment. Sorry, the video is just, well, it's a bit slow, like we're a bit late. But I thank you all so much for attending and giving your time. Thank you for everyone for listening and the amazing questions. There are a couple we did get to. We will send out to everyone that was enrolled to see this, the answers, the missing answers. And really thrilled to launch ACLI, the Australasian Cyber Law Institute, and a very quick plug that we have another of these events coming up on the 30th of September. It'll be at 5 p.m. again, and this is about still technology, electronic will signings, and do the COVID regulations work, and should we even bother? Because guess what, 500 plus people died in Victoria in the last 6 months, and I don't know how many of them were able to execute a will at the last minute. So not to end on a sad note, but to end on a very happy note. Thank you all so much for your time, and I hope you have a little nutshell about what ACLI will be doing in the future. Thanks again, and have a lovely evening.